The baby's cry cut through the dawn silence, like a blade through Jake Dunlap's troubled sleep. He'd been dreaming of the Warren again, of Marshal Henderson's cold eyes promising a rope, when the thin wail from his cabin door jerked him awake. Jake's hand found his Colt before his feet hit the rough plank floor, years of running having taught him that unexpected sounds meant trouble. But when he eased the door open, gun drawn and ready, nothing could have prepared him for what he found. A basket sat on his weathered doorstep, and from within came that desperate cry that seemed to reach right into his chest and squeeze. A baby, no more than a few months old by the look of it, wrapped in a faded blue blanket that had seen better days. Pinned to the blanket was a scrap of paper with words scrawled in a woman's desperate hand. His name is Samuel. Please. Jake stood there in his union suit and bare feet, the morning cold biting at his skin, staring down at this tiny life that someone had left for him to find. Him, Jake Dunlap, wanted in 3 territories for robbery and worse. A man who'd spent the last 5 years looking over his shoulder, sleeping with one eye open, trusting no one. The irony wasn't lost on him that someone had chosen an outlaw's doorstep as a place of refuge. The baby's cries grew more insistent, and Jake found himself holstering his gun and reaching down to lift the basket. The child was so small, so fragile, that Jake's calloused hands shook as he carried the bundle inside his one-room cabin. He'd never held a baby before, never had cause to, and the responsibility of it terrified him more than any posse ever had. Samuel, the note had said. The baby looked up at him with dark eyes that seemed too old for such a small face, and Jake felt something shift inside his chest, something he thought died the day he put on his first mask and robbed his first bank. The child had stopped crying now, seeming to study Jake's weathered face with an intensity that made the outlaw uncomfortable. "Well, Samuel," Jake said, his voice rough from disuse, "ain't much of a place you've been left, but it's what we got." The cabin was sparse, containing little more than a narrow bed, a table and chair, a wood stove, and shelves lined with canned goods and ammunition. Not exactly fit for a baby, but Jake had learned to make do with less. The question that hammered at him was what he was supposed to do now. He couldn't exactly ride into Millbrook with a baby in his arms, not with his face plastered on wanted posters from here to Denver. But as the morning wore on and Samuel grew fussy again, Jake realized he didn't have much choice. The baby needed milk, needed proper care, and Jake Dunlap might be an outlaw, but he wasn't the kind of man who could leave a child to suffer. His own father had abandoned him when he was barely older than Samuel, and the memory of that betrayal still burned in his gut. Jake spent the morning fashioning a sling from an old shirt. Tucking Samuel against his chest with a baby, seemed content to sleep. Then he saddled his horse, pulled his hat low, and rode toward town, every instinct screaming that he was making a mistake. But Samuel's small weight against his ribs reminded him that some things mattered more than his own safety. Millbrook was a tired frontier town that had seen better days, its main street dusty and lined with buildings that leaned against each other like drunks seeking support. Jake tied his horse outside Murphy's General Store and pulled his hat even lower, hoping his beard had grown thick enough to disguise his features. He needed milk, baby clothes, whatever supplies a child required that he didn't even know to ask for. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and Murphy looked up from behind the counter, his eyes immediately focusing on the bundle Jake carried. "Help you with something, mister?" "Need some supplies," Jake said, keeping his voice low, "for the baby." Murphy's expression softened slightly. "Your boy." Jake hesitated for a moment, then nodded. It wasn't exactly a lie, he reasoned. Samuel was his responsibility now, which made the child his in the ways that mattered. Need milk, diapers, whatever else babies require. "Canned milk's what you want," Murphy said, coming around the counter. "Mix it with water, warm it up some. Got cloth diapers, safety pins, bottles." He paused, studying Jake's face with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to read strangers. "You new to fatherhood?" "You could say that," Jake replied, his hand instinctively moving to rest on Samuel's back. The baby stirred at the touch, but didn't wake. Murphy gathered the supplies, talking as he worked. "Take some getting used to, having a little one. My Sarah. She knew right off what to do with our young ones, but me? I was terrified I'd break something." He chuckled, then glanced at Jake again. "Your wife know what she's about?" The question hit Jake like a physical blow. Ain't got a wife, he said simply. Murphy's hands stilled on the items he was collecting. I see. Well, that makes things harder, I suppose. He resumed his work, but Jake could feel the man's curiosity like a weight. Been in Millbrook long? Just passing through, Jake lied, though he'd been holed up in the cabin for 3 months, waiting for the heat to die down after his last job. Might want to think about staying a spell, Murphy said. Young one like that needs stability, and we got a good woman in town, Clara Mason. Lost her own baby 2 years back, and her husband in the same fever that took the child. He's got experience with little ones, helps out the other mothers when they need it. Jake's jaw tightened. The last thing he needed was some woman poking around, asking questions. But as Samuel shifted against his chest and made a small sound, Jake realized he was in over his head. He didn't know the first thing about caring for a baby, and Samuel deserved better than Jake's fumbling attempts at parenting. Where might I find this Clara Mason? He asked reluctantly. Runs the boarding house on Elm Street. White house with the green shutters, can't miss it. Murphy finished gathering the supplies and named a price that made Jake wince. His funds were running low, and he couldn't exactly rob another bank with Samuel to consider. Jake paid and left quickly, feeling Murphy's eyes on his back. He'd stayed too long, revealed too much, but Samuel's needs had to come first. He rode toward Elm Street, telling himself he'd just ask for advice and move on. He couldn't afford to get attached to this place or its people. The boarding house was exactly as Murphy had described, well-maintained and welcoming in a way that made Jake instantly suspicious. He tied his horse to the post and approached the front door, Samuel sleeping peacefully in the sling. Before he could knock, the door opened, and Jake found himself face to face with a woman who couldn't have been much past 25. Clara Mason was pretty in a quiet way, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and gray eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a simple blue dress covered by a white apron, and there was something about her bearing that spoke of competence and inner strength. When her gaze fell on Samuel, her expression softened in a way that made Jake's chest tighten. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice carrying the slight accent of someone raised back east. "Murphy at the general store said you might have experience with babies," Jake said, the words coming out more gruff than he'd intended. "This here's Samuel, and I'm new to all this." Clara's eyes moved from the baby to Jake's face, and he saw her take in his weathered features, the careful way he held himself, the gun at his hip. She was evaluating him, trying to decide what kind of man he was, and Jake found himself hoping desperately that she'd see something worth helping. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward Samuel. Jake hesitated, every instinct telling him not to trust anyone, but something in Clara's manner convinced him to nod. She stepped closer, and Jake caught the scent of lavender and fresh bread, homey smells that he hadn't experienced in years. Her hands were gentle as she examined Samuel, checking his color, the way he breathed, the alertness in his eyes when he briefly opened them. "He's beautiful," she said softly. "How old would you say? Maybe 3 months?" Jake guessed. Clara nodded. "About that, I'd think. He seems healthy, well-formed." She looked up at Jake again. His mother? The question Jake had been dreading. "Gone," he said simply, which was true enough. Something in Clara's expression shifted, became more sympathetic. "I'm sorry. That's a heavy burden for a man to carry alone." "I ain't looking for pity," Jake said, more sharply than he'd meant to. "I'm not offering any," Clara replied calmly. "Just understanding. Would you like to come in? I can show you how to prepare his milk properly. Check if you have everything you need." Jake looked at the open door, at the warm light spilling from within, and felt a longing so strong it nearly knocked him backward. When was the last time someone had invited him inside, offered him kindness without expecting anything in return? But accepting meant risk, meant lowering his guard, and that was something Jake Dunlap couldn't afford. "I don't want to impose," he said. "You're not imposing. Samuel needs proper care, and I suspect you need some guidance. That's not charity, it's practical sense." The baby chose that moment to wake up and begin fussing, his small face scrunching with displeasure. Clara immediately reached out, her hands hovering near Samuel but not quite touching. "May I?" Jake found himself nodding, and Clara gently lifted Samuel from a sling. The baby quieted almost immediately in her arms, and Jake felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy. Clara had a natural way with the child that made Jake's own fumbling attempts seem clumsy by comparison. "He's hungry," Clara said, swaying slightly as she held Samuel. "When did he last eat?" Jake's face flushed. I ain't sure. Found him this morning, and I've been trying to figure out what to do since then." Clara's eyebrows rose, but she didn't ask the obvious questions. Instead, she stepped back and gestured toward the door. "Come inside. We need to get him fed, and then we can talk about what he'll need going forward." Jake followed her into the boarding house, his hand unconsciously resting on his gun, but the interior was as welcoming as the exterior suggested, with polished wood floors, comfortable furniture, and the lingering smell of whatever Clara had been baking. She led him to the kitchen, a bright room with yellow curtains and a table scrubbed white with use. "Sit," Clara said, settling Samuel in Jake's arms while she bustled around the kitchen. "I'll warm some milk and show you how to test the temperature." Jake sat stiffly in the offered chair, hyper-aware of everything around him. The back door, the windows, the knife block on the counter. Old habits died hard, and even in this peaceful setting, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that danger might come calling. But Samuel was looking up at him with those serious dark eyes, and Jake found himself relaxing despite his caution. Clara worked efficiently, heating milk in a small pan and testing drops on her wrist. "Too hot and you'll burn his mouth, too cold and he won't want it," she explained. "About body temperature is what you're aiming for." She prepared a bottle and handed it to Jake, then showed him how to hold Samuel, how to angle the bottle, how to watch for signs that the baby was getting too much too fast. Samuel latched onto the bottle eagerly, his small hands grasping at Jake's fingers, and Jake felt that strange tightness in his chest again. "You're doing fine," Clara said softly, and Jake realized she'd been watching him feed the baby. "He trusts you already." "Don't know why he should," Jake muttered. "Children are good judges of character," Clara replied. "They can sense when someone means them harm, and when someone wants to protect them. Samuel knows you're safe." Jake looked down at the baby in his arms, at the tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb, and wondered if Clara was right. Could this small creature really see something in Jake that Jake himself had forgotten existed? The possibility was both terrifying and hopeful. "You'll need to feed him every few hours," Clara continued, settling into the chair across from Jake. "Change his diapers when they're soiled. Make sure he stays warm and clean. It's not complicated, but it's constant." "I can handle constant," Jake said. He'd spent years staying alert, staying ready, and caring for Samuel couldn't be more demanding than staying one step ahead of the law. Clara smiled, the first genuine smile she'd shown him, and Jake was surprised by how it transformed her face. "I think you can, but you'll need help, especially at first. Do you have somewhere to stay?" Jake hesitated. "Got a place. In town?" "Near enough." Clara studied him for a moment, and Jake could see her trying to piece together his story. A man alone with a baby, reluctant to answer questions, wearing a gun like he knew how to use it. She had to be wondering what his situation really was. "I run this boarding house," she said finally. "Clean rooms, good meals, reasonable rates. You might consider staying here while you get settled with Samuel. It would be easier than trying to manage everything on your own." The offer was tempting, more tempting than Jake wanted to admit. The thought of regular meals, of help with Samuel, of Clara's quiet competence nearby, made him want to say yes more than he'd wanted anything in years. But staying meant exposure, meant people getting to know him, and that was a luxury Jake Dunlap couldn't afford. "I appreciate the offer," he said carefully, "but I reckon we'll manage fine where we are." Clara nodded, though Jake could see disappointment in her eyes. "Of course, but the offer stands. If you change your mind, and I hope you bring Samuel by regular-like, so I can make sure he's thriving." Samuel had finished the bottle and was making small, contented sounds against Jake's chest. Clara showed him how to burp the baby, how to check if the diaper needed changing, and Jake found himself memorizing every word she said. This woman might be the difference between Samuel thriving and merely surviving, and Jake was determined not to let the child down. As the afternoon wore on, Clara shared more practical advice. How to tell if Samuel was sick, what sounds were normal and which ones meant trouble, how to make the cabin safer for a small child. Jake listened intently, asking questions when he didn't understand, and gradually began to feel like maybe, just maybe, he could do this. "One more thing," Clara said as Jake prepared to leave. Samuel will need other children around as he grows, need to learn how to be part of a community. Children raised in isolation don't always know how to connect with other people later on. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd been raised in isolation after his father left, had learned early that trusting people only led to betrayal and pain. Was he condemning Samuel to the same lonely existence? But what choice did he have? His presence put anyone near him in danger, and that included Samuel. "I'll keep that in mind," Jake said, though he had no idea how to act on Clara's advice. Clara walked him to the door, carrying the supplies he'd bought at Murphy's store. "Jake," she said, and he realized he must have told her his name at some point, though he couldn't remember doing so. Taking care of a child changes a man. Don't be surprised if you find yourself becoming someone you didn't expect. Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He settled Samuel back in the sling, tipped his hat to Clara, and rode away from Millbrook as the sun began to set. But as his cabin came into view, he found himself looking back toward town, toward the warm lights beginning to flicker in windows, toward the life he could never allow himself to have. That night, as Jake fed Samuel by lamplight and listened to the baby's soft breathing, he made a promise to himself and to the child in his arms. He would keep Samuel safe no matter what it cost him. He would learn to be the father the boy needed, even if it meant sacrificing everything else. And maybe if he was very careful and very lucky, he could give Samuel the childhood Jake himself had never had. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of storms to come. Jake pulled Samuel closer and began to plan how he would protect this small life that had become more important to him than his own freedom, more precious than his own safety. He was still an outlaw, still a wanted man, but now he was something else too. Now he was a father. The summer heat shimmered off the dusty main street of Millbrook as Jake Dunlap guided his horse toward Clara's boarding house, Samuel secure in the leather sling he'd crafted across his chest. 3 months had passed since that morning when he'd found the baby on his doorstep, and the child had transformed not just Jake's daily routine, but something fundamental in his very soul. Samuel was thriving now, his cheeks round and healthy, his dark eyes bright with curiosity about the world around him. More than that, the baby had begun to smile, real deliberate smiles that he saved especially for Jake, and each one hit the former outlaw like a physical blow to the chest. Jake had fallen into a rhythm he'd never expected to find comfortable. Morning feedings by lamplight in his cabin, the ride into town for supplies and Clara's guidance, afternoons spent learning the countless small skills that caring for a child required. He'd become expert at mixing formula to the right temperature, at changing diapers with swift efficiency, at recognizing the different meanings behind Samuel's various cries. The baby had needs that couldn't be ignored or postponed, and meeting those needs had given Jake's life a structure and purpose he hadn't realized he'd been missing. But it was more than just routine that had changed. Samuel's presence in his life had begun to snap open something in Jake's chest that he'd thought permanently sealed. The baby trusted him completely, would quiet at the sound of his voice, would reach for him with small, grasping hands whenever Jake came into view. That trust was both humbling and terrifying, because Jake knew better than anyone how little he deserved it. The wanted posters were still up around town, though Jake had noticed that his likeness was aging poorly, his beard now fuller than the clean-shaven man depicted in the drawings. Still, he kept his hat pulled low and avoided lingering in public spaces. But Samuel made him memorable in ways that his face alone never had, and Jake was grimly aware that a man with a baby was the kind of detail people remembered. Clara was waiting for them in her kitchen, as she had taken to doing on Tuesday and Friday mornings. She claimed it was to monitor Samuel's development, but Jake suspected she simply enjoyed their visits as much as he did. She looked up from kneading bread dough when he entered, flour dusting her apron, and a strand of dark hair escaping from her careful bun. "Right on time," she said, smiling at Samuel, who immediately began babbling excitedly at the sight of her. "And how are we today, little man?" Jake lifted Samuel from the sling and handed him to Clara, watching as the baby settled contentedly into her arms. The ease with which she held him, the natural way she swayed to soothe him, reminded Jake constantly of what Samuel was missing without a mother. Clara had become the closest thing to maternal care the baby had, and Jake was grateful for her attention, even as it made him painfully aware of his own limitations. "Been trying to get him to take some of that mashed food you suggested," Jake said, settling into the chair that had become his usual spot. "But he's not much interested in anything that ain't milk." "He's still young for solid food," Clara replied, examining Samuel's face and hands with the practice she developed over the past months. "But we can try again today. Sometimes it takes seeing someone else eat to spark their interest." She prepared a small portion of mashed vegetables while Jake held Samuel, talking softly to the baby about the various items in Clara's kitchen. Samuel had become fascinated by new sights and sounds, and Jake had discovered he enjoyed narrating their experiences, pointing out birds and horses and people as they went through their daily routine. The morning routine had become precious to Jake in ways he'd never expected. Samuel would sit in his lap, reaching for the spoon, trying to participate in his own feeding, even though his coordination wasn't quite there yet. Clara would laugh at the baby's efforts, would patiently clean up the inevitable mess, and Jake would find himself memorizing every detail of these peaceful moments. He'd lived his entire adult life without expecting to see another sunrise, and now he found himself looking forward to each day simply because it meant more time with Samuel. "Jake," Clara said suddenly, her tone more serious than usual, "I had some visitors yesterday asking about you." Jake's blood went cold, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun before he caught himself. "What kind of visitors?" "Two men said they were traveling through, but they were asking very specific questions. About a man with a baby, about how long you've been coming to town, about where you might be staying." Clara's gray eyes were steady on his face. "I told them I didn't know what they were talking about." Jake's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Marshal Henderson had been tracking him for over a year, and Jake had always known the man wouldn't give up easily. But he'd hoped that caring for Samuel might have bought him more time, that Henderson might have moved on to easier prey. Apparently not. "What did they look like?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady for Samuel's sake. One was tall, thin, with cold eyes, had a badge, though he kept it mostly hidden. The other was shorter, stockier, seemed nervous. The tall one did most of the talking. Clara paused in her food preparation, her hands stilling on the bowl she was holding. "Jake, whatever trouble you're running from, maybe it's time to face it. For Samuel's sake, if not your own." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd known this conversation would come eventually, had seen the questions building in Clara's eyes over the past weeks. She was too smart not to have pieced together at least part of his story, too observant not to have noticed his caution, his reluctance to answer direct questions about his past. "It ain't that simple," Jake said finally. "It never is," Clara replied. "But running isn't a life for a child, Jake. Samuel needs stability, needs to know he belongs somewhere. And you—" She hesitated, then forged ahead. "You need to decide what kind of man you want to be for him." Jake looked down at Samuel, who was watching their conversation with the serious attention he brought to everything around him. The baby had begun reaching for objects now, and his small hand was currently wrapped around Jake's finger with surprising strength. How could Jake explain that the kind of man he wanted to be for Samuel was exactly the kind of man his past wouldn't let him become? "I've been trying to be a good father to him," Jake said quietly. "You have been," Clara said firmly. "Samuel is healthy and happy and clearly loves you. But being a good father means more than just meeting his immediate needs. It means giving him a future, a place in the world." Before Jake could respond, Samuel made a grab for the spoon Clara was holding, managing to get his fingers around it and immediately trying to put it in his mouth. Clara laughed and gently redirected his attention to the mashed vegetables, managing to get a small amount past his lips. Samuel's face scrunched with surprise at the new flavor, but he didn't spit it out. "There we go," Clara said encouragingly. "Not so bad, is it?" Watching her feed Samuel, seeing the patient way she coaxed him to try new things, Jake felt that familiar ache in his chest. This was what Samuel needed, what he deserved, and Jake was too selfish to walk away, even knowing he couldn't give the baby everything he required. The morning continued with the familiar rhythm they'd established. Clara would work on her household tasks while Jake fed Samuel, and they would talk about everything and nothing. The weather, the other residents of the boarding house, Samuel's latest developments. It was domestic in a way that Jake had never experienced, and he found himself treasuring these ordinary moments more than any excitement he'd ever chased as an outlaw. Samuel had grown significantly over the past months. He could sit up now with support, could transfer objects from one hand to the other, and had begun making sounds that almost resembled words. Clara insisted that his babbling was becoming more sophisticated, that he was trying to communicate specific ideas, even if the adults couldn't understand them yet. "He's going to be an early talker," Clara said, wiping Samuel's face clean after another attempt at solid food. "Some babies are content to just observe the world. But Samuel wants to participate. He wants to be part of the conversation." "Wonder where he gets that from," Jake said dryly, and Clara laughed. "Certainly not from his taciturn father," she teased, and Jake felt a warmth in his chest at being called Samuel's father so naturally, so casually. But the lightness of the moment was overshadowed by the knowledge that men were looking for them, that their peaceful routine was under threat. Jake found himself studying Clara's face, memorizing the way she looked when she smiled at Samuel, the gentle competence of her hands as she cared for the baby. If he had to run again, he would lose this, and the thought was almost unbearable. "Clara," Jake said slowly, "if something was to happen to me, would you?" "Nothing's going to happen to you," Clara interrupted firmly. "Not if you stop running and start fighting for the life you want. You don't understand what you're asking." "Then explain it to me." Jake was quiet for a long moment, listening to Samuel's contented sounds as Clara continued feeding him small spoonfuls of food. The baby was getting better at it, learning to work with a spoon rather than against it, and Jake felt a surge of pride at this small accomplishment. Samuel was learning, growing, becoming more himself every day, and Jake was terrified of doing anything that might disrupt that development. "I've done things," Jake said finally. "Bad things. Things that can't be undone or forgiven." "Have you killed anyone who didn't deserve killing?" Clara asked bluntly. The directness of the question caught Jake off guard. He thought about the men he'd shot, the violence that had marked his years as an outlaw. Most of it had been in self-defense, men who'd drawn on him first. But there had been moments when the line between justice and revenge had blurred beyond recognition. "No," he said finally, "but I've robbed banks, stolen money that belonged to other people. Got wanted posters with my name on them in 3 territories. Money can be repaid," Clara said calmly, as if discussing the weather. "Banks insure their deposits, and most of what gets stolen ends up being covered anyway. The question is whether you're the same man who did those things, or whether you become someone different." Jake looked at her in amazement. She was taking his confession of criminal activity with a composure that suggested she'd already suspected as much. More than that, she seemed to be suggesting that his past didn't necessarily define his future, a possibility that Jake had never dared to consider. "Samuel's changed me," Jake admitted. "Change what I want, what I'm willing to do. But that don't erase what I'd done before." "No, it doesn't," Clara agreed. "But it might be the foundation for building something better." Samuel had finished eating and was beginning to fuss, so Clara lifted him to her shoulder and began the gentle patting that would help him settle. Jake watched her natural movements, the way she anticipated the baby's needs, and felt a longing so sharp it was almost unbearable. This woman had become essential to Samuel's well-being, and increasingly essential to Jake's own sense of what his life could be. "Those men who came asking about me," Jake said, "they'll be back." "Probably," Clara said. "The question is what you're going to do about it." Jake was quiet for a long time, thinking about his options. He could run again, pack up Samuel, and disappear into the wilderness. But Clara was right that it was no kind of life for a child. Samuel needed stability, needed routine, needed the kind of community that Millbrook was beginning to offer him. He could try to fight, but that would mean violence, and he'd sworn to himself that Samuel would never see that side of him. Or he could surrender, hope that his cooperation might earn him some consideration. But that would mean leaving Samuel alone in the world. "There might be another way," Clara said quietly, as if she'd been following his thoughts. "Judge Whitman in the territorial capital is known to be fair, known to consider circumstances when he's sentencing. If you were to turn yourself involuntarily, especially with evidence that you're trying to make amends." "Evidence like what?" "Like taking responsibility for a child who needed care, like becoming part of a community, contributing instead of taking, like being willing to make restitution for what you stole. Jake stared at her. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about Samuel, Clara corrected. About what's best for him. And I think what's best is having his father free and clear, able to raise him without looking over his shoulder. Samuel had fallen asleep against Clara's shoulder, his small body completely relaxed in her arms. Jake reached out to stroke the baby's hair, marveling again at how soft it was, how perfectly formed this small person had become. In sleep, Samuel's face was peaceful, trusting, completely vulnerable. He depended on Jake for everything: food, shelter, protection, love, and Jake was determined not to fail him. Even if Judge Whitman was inclined to be lenient, Jake said, I'd still face prison time. Years, probably. Samuel would be alone. Samuel would be cared for, Clara said firmly. By me, by this community. And when you got out, you'd be free to build a real life with him. The offer was staggering in its generosity, and Jake felt his throat constrict with emotion he couldn't express. This woman, who owed him nothing, was willing to take on the care of his child, to wait for him through however many years a judge might decree. It was more than he'd ever dared to hope for, more kindness than he'd ever thought he deserved. Why? He asked hoarsely. Clara was quiet for a moment, her hand moving in gentle circles on Samuel's back. The baby sighed in his sleep, a small sound of perfect contentment, and Jake felt his heart constrict with love so fierce it was painful. Because Samuel deserves better than always being afraid, she said finally. Because you deserve a chance to be the man I can see you're trying to become. And because... She paused, a faint flush coloring her cheeks. Because I've come to care about both of you more than I probably should. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Jake didn't dare examine too closely. He'd been careful not to read too much into Clara's kindness, telling himself that her interest was purely in Samuel's welfare. But the way she looked at him sometimes, the way her touch lingered when she handed Samuel back to him, suggested that her feelings might run deeper than simple Christian charity. Clara, he began, but she shook her head. Don't say anything you can't mean, she said. Just think about what I've suggested. Samuel's getting older every day, and soon he'll start noticing things, understanding more about the world around him. Do you want him to grow up knowing his father was a man who ran from his responsibilities, or a man who faced them? The question cut deep, touching on Jake's deepest fears about what kind of father he was, what kind of example he was setting. Samuel was too young now to understand the tension that surrounded their life, but that wouldn't last forever. Eventually, the boy would begin to ask questions, would notice the way Jake watched the horizon, the way he never quite relaxed even in peaceful moments. Samuel stirred in Clara's arms, making the small sounds that meant he was beginning to wake. Clara transferred him back to Jake, and the baby immediately settled again at the familiar scent and feel of his father. Jake held his son close, breathing in the sweet smell of his hair, and tried to imagine what kind of future he could build for this precious life. I need time to think, Jake said. Of course. But Jake, don't take too long. Those men will be back, and when they come, it would be better if you were ready for them. Jake spent the rest of the morning with Clara, learning to prepare new foods for Samuel, discussing the baby's development, and trying not to think about the impossible decision she'd laid before him. Samuel was becoming more interactive every day, reaching for objects that caught his interest, responding to his name, beginning to show preferences for certain people and activities. He was developing a personality, becoming more than just a small bundle of needs. And Jake found himself enchanted by every new development. When other residents of the boarding house came through the kitchen, they always stopped to greet Samuel, to comment on how much he'd grown, to offer small gifts or observations about his development. Mrs. Henderson from room 3 had knitted him a small blanket. Mr. Davies, the traveling salesman, always brought him a small toy from his cases. Even crusty old Tom McCready would soften when Samuel smiled at him, would make faces to try to coax a laugh from the baby. Samuel was becoming part of this community in ways that Jake had never expected, and people genuinely seemed to care about the baby's well-being. It was a kind of acceptance and belonging that Jake had never experienced for himself, and seeing it offered so freely to his son both warmed his heart and broke it a little. When it came time to leave, Clara walked them to the door, her hand resting briefly on Jake's arm as he settled Samuel in his sling. The touch was fleeting, probably meant as simple comfort, but it sent warmth shooting through Jake's entire body. "Whatever you decide," she said quietly, "know that you're not alone in this. Samuel has people who care about him, who will make sure he's all right." Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He mounted his horse and rode toward home, Samuel content against his chest, Clara's words echoing in his mind. For the first time since he'd found the baby on his doorstep, Jake allowed himself to consider the possibility of a different kind of future, one where he and Samuel could build a life together without constantly looking over their shoulders. But as the afternoon sun beat down on them and the cabin came into view, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The men Clara had described would be back, and when they came, he would have to choose between the safety he'd built for Samuel and the freedom that had defined his entire adult life. It was a choice that would determine not just his own fate, but the kind of man Samuel would grow up calling father. That evening, as Jake fed Samuel his dinner and listened to the baby's increasingly complex babbling, he made a silent promise to the child in his arms. Whatever decision he made, it would be based on what was best for Samuel, not on what was easiest for Jake Dunlap. The baby had given him a reason to be better than he'd ever been before, and Jake was determined not to let him down, no matter what it cost. The first frost came early that year, painting the windows of Jake's cabin with delicate ice patterns that caught the morning light like tiny diamonds. Samuel, now 6 months old and sitting up on his own, pressed his small hands against the cold glass and babbled excitedly at the new phenomenon. Jake watched from the kitchen table, where he was preparing the baby's morning bottle, marveling as always at how everything was new and wonderful to Samuel's eyes. "Frost, little man," Jake said, lifting Samuel and carrying him to the window. "Means winter's coming. Means we need to start thinking about keeping warm." Samuel reached toward the patterns on the glass, his breath fogging the cold surface as he made the happy sounds that had become Jake's favorite music. The baby had begun to show real personality now, laughing at things that amused him, fussing when he was bored, clearly preferring some people and activities over others. Clara insisted he was trying to say Papa, though Jake couldn't quite convince himself that the pop-papa sounds Samuel made were actually directed at him. The past month had been both the happiest and most terrifying of Jake's life. Samuel was thriving, growing stronger and more interactive every day, but the shadow of those two men hung over everything. Jake had taken to varying his routes to town, to watching the horizon more carefully, to keeping his gun closer at hand. The peaceful domestic routine he'd built with Samuel felt increasingly fragile, like something that could shatter at the first sign of real trouble. Clara had been patient with his indecision, but Jake could see the worry growing in her eyes. She'd taken to keeping Samuel longer during their visits, teaching Jake new skills for the baby's development, while clearly savoring every moment with the child. It was as if she was trying to store up memories against an uncertain future, and the realization made Jake's chest tight with guilt and longing. As he fed Samuel his breakfast, Jake found himself studying the baby's face, looking for signs of himself in the child's features. Samuel had dark hair like Jake's, but his eyes were lighter, more trusting than Jake's had ever been. There was an openness to Samuel's expression, a willingness to engage with the world that Jake feared his own cautious nature might eventually diminish. "We need to make some decisions, don't we, son?" Jake said softly, wiping milk from Samuel's chin. "Can't keep living day to day, hoping trouble won't find us." Samuel babbled in response, reaching for Jake's face with sticky fingers, and Jake felt that familiar surge of fierce protectiveness. This child trusted him completely, depended on him for everything, and Jake would die before he let anyone hurt Samuel. But dying might not be enough if it left the baby alone and unprotected. The sound of hoofbeats outside made Jake freeze, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. It was too early for his usual trip to town, and he wasn't expecting visitors. Through the window he could see two riders approaching the cabin, and even at a distance, Jake recognized the tall, lean silhouette of Marshal Henderson. "Stay quiet, Samuel," Jake whispered, though the baby couldn't understand the urgency in his voice. Jake moved quickly, checking his weapons, calculating distances and angles, preparing for the confrontation he'd been dreading for months. Henderson dismounted slowly, his deputy staying mounted and keeping his rifle ready. The marshal was older than Jake remembered, his hair gone gray at the temples. But his cold blue eyes were exactly as Jake had seen them in his nightmares. "Jake Dunlap," Henderson called out, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. "I know you're in there. Come out and let's talk." Jake considered his options. The cabin offered some protection, but it was also a trap if Henderson decided to wait him out. Samuel was babbling happily, unaware of the danger, and Jake knew he couldn't risk a siege with the baby depending on him. "What do you want, Henderson?" Jake called back, not moving from his position by the window. "Want to talk? Just talk. You got something in there worth more than your freedom, and I'm curious about what that might be." Jake's blood ran cold. Henderson knew about Samuel, which meant he'd been asking questions in town, piecing together Jake's new life from the stories people told. The marshal was clever, patient. Exactly the kind of lawman who would use Jake's love for the baby against him. "Got nothing to say to you," Jake replied. "Maybe not, but I got plenty to say to you. About that baby you've been caring for. About the woman in town who's been helping you raise him. About what happens to a child when his daddy gets himself killed being stubborn." The threat was clear, and Jake felt rage surge through him like wildfire. Henderson was threatening Samuel, threatening Clara, using Jake's newfound capacity for love as a weapon against him. It was exactly what Jake had feared most, the reason he'd spent years avoiding any kind of emotional attachment. "You leave them out of this," Jake said, his voice deadly quiet. "Can't do that, Dunlap. You made them part of it when you decided to play house instead of taking responsibility for what you done. Now come out here and let's settle this like civilized men." Jake looked at Samuel, who was watching him with those serious dark eyes, sensing the tension even if he couldn't understand it. The baby reached for Jake, making small sounds of distress, and Jake felt his heart break a little. This was exactly what he'd hoped to spare Samuel, the violence and fear that had defined Jake's own life. But Henderson was right about one thing. Hiding wouldn't solve anything. The marshal had found them once, and he'd find them again if Jake ran. And next time he might not be in a talking mood. "I'm coming out," Jake called, "but I got the baby with me, so nobody does anything stupid. Nobody wants to hurt a child, Dunlap. Just want to have a conversation." Jake holstered his gun and lifted Samuel, settling the baby in his arms where he could protect him if shooting started. Samuel immediately calmed at his father's touch, though he continued to watch Jake's face with that unnerving intensity. Jake opened the cabin door and stepped into the cold morning air, Samuel bundled against his chest. Henderson was standing about 20 feet away, his hand resting casually on his gun, but his deputy still mounted and alert. The marshal's eyes immediately focused on Samuel, and Jake saw something like surprise cross his weathered features. "Well, I'll be damned," Henderson said softly. "Heard tell about it, but seeing it's something else entirely. You really are caring for that baby." "He's my son," Jake said firmly. "Is he now?" "Funny thing about that. Been asking around town, and nobody seems to know where this child came from. Just appeared one day, like a miracle." Henderson's cold eyes studied Jake's face. "Or like someone left him on your doorstep, knowing you take him in." Jake said nothing, but his arms tightened protectively around Samuel. The baby was beginning to fuss, sensing the tension in the air, and Jake swayed slightly to soothe him. "Don't matter how he came to be with me," Jake said. "He's mine now, and I ain't letting anything happen to him." "Noble sentiment," Henderson said dryly. "But caring for one child don't erase 5 years of robbery and violence, Dunlap. You got debts to pay, and the law ain't known for its patience. What do you want?" Jake asked bluntly. Henderson smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I want you to come back with me. Face trial. Pay your debts, serve your time. Do the right thing for once in your miserable life. And Samuel? Baby will be cared for. Territory's got institutions for orphans, people who know how to raise children proper. He'll get schooling, learn trade, maybe make something of himself instead of following in his daddy's footsteps." The casual dismissal of Jake's relationship with Samuel, the assumption that the baby would be better off without him, hit Jake like a physical blow. But worse was the image of Samuel in some cold institution, growing up without love, without the warmth and attention he'd come to expect from Jake and Clara. "He ain't an orphan," Jake said quietly. "He's got a father who loves him. Father who's wanted for robbery in 3 territories, Henderson countered. Father who can't give him a proper home, proper education, proper future. Sometimes loving someone means letting them go, Dunlap. Samuel had begun to cry, the kind of tired, fussy sound that meant he needed feeding and changing in the comfort of familiar routine. Jake automatically began the gentle bouncing motion that usually soothed the baby, his mind racing through impossible options. I need to take care of him, Jake said. Take all the time you need, Henderson replied. We ain't going anywhere. Jake retreated into the cabin, his mind working frantically as he tended to Samuel's needs. The baby's routine continued unchanged, bottles to be warmed, diapers to be changed, small comforts to be provided. But everything felt different now, weighted with the knowledge that this might be one of the last times Jake would be able to care for his son. As he fed Samuel, Jake found himself memorizing details he'd taken for granted. The way the baby's small hand gripped his finger during feeding, the satisfied sound Samuel made when he was content, the way he would look up at Jake with complete trust and love. These were the moments Jake had never expected to have, never thought he deserved. And now they were slipping away like water through his fingers. Through the window, Jake could see Henderson and his deputy waiting with the patience of men who had all the time in the world. They'd dismounted now, were sharing coffee from a thermos, treating this like any other job. But for Jake, it was the end of everything that mattered. Samuel finished his bottle and immediately began the babbling that Clara insisted was his attempt at conversation. The baby was happy, secure in Jake's arms, completely unaware that his world was about to change forever. Jake felt tears threaten for the first time since he was a child, and he had to look away from Samuel's trusting face. I'm sorry, son, Jake whispered. I'm so damn sorry. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, and Jake tensed, expecting Henderson's impatience. But the voice that called out was Clara's, clear and determined despite the obvious fear beneath it. Jake, are you all right? I saw the horses, saw the men. Jake moved quickly to the door, opening it to find Clara standing on his doorstep, her face pale, but her chin set with determination. Behind her, he could see Murphy from the general store, Tom McCready from the boarding house, and several other townspeople, all carrying rifles or shotguns. Clara, you need to get out of here, Jake said urgently. This ain't safe. Neither is letting you face this alone, Clara replied, pushing past him into the cabin. She immediately moved to Samuel, lifting the baby from Jake's arms with practiced ease. Hello, sweetheart, she murmured to Samuel, who immediately calmed at her familiar touch. Ma'am, Henderson's voice came from outside. This is official business. You need to move along. Clara appeared in the doorway, Samuel in her arms, her gray eyes blazing with protective fury. This is my business, Marshal. This man and this child are part of my community, and we don't abandon our own. Jake stared at her in amazement. She was facing down a federal marshal, putting herself in danger, all for him and Samuel. Behind her, the other townspeople had formed a loose line, their weapons ready, their faces grim with purpose. Clara, please, Jake said. You don't understand what you're doing. I understand perfectly, Clara replied without taking her eyes off Henderson. I understand that Jake Dunlap might have made mistakes in his past, but the man standing in this cabin is a good father who's been nothing but helpful to this community. I understand that Samuel needs the man who's been caring for him since he was abandoned, not some cold institution. And I understand that sometimes doing what's right matters more than doing what's legal. Henderson's expression had gone cold and dangerous. You're interfering with federal law enforcement, ma'am. That's a serious crime. So is threatening innocent children, Murphy called out from behind Clara. We heard what you said about taking the baby away from his daddy. Jake felt something shift in his chest, something he'd never experienced before in his entire life. These people, this community, were standing up for him. They were willing to face down federal marshals, willing to risk their own safety, all because they'd come to care about him and Samuel. It was the kind of loyalty and acceptance he'd never dared to dream of, and it was being offered freely, without conditions or expectations. This ain't your fight, Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. It is now, Clara said firmly, then turned to face Henderson. Marshal, I'd like to propose an alternative to your current plan. Henderson's eyebrows rose skeptically. I'm listening. Jake turns himself involuntarily, agrees to face trial and make restitution for his crimes. In exchange, Samuel stays here in Millbrook in my care until Jake serves his time. When he's released, he comes back to his son and his community. And why would I agree to that? Henderson asked. Because it's the right thing to do, Clara said simply. Because children need stability and love, not institutions. Because a man who's willing to surrender himself to protect a child has already begun paying for his crimes. And because... She paused, looking directly at Jake. Because this community vouches for him. We've seen who he is now, not just who he was. Jake felt his throat constrict with emotion. Clara was offering him everything he'd never dared to hope for. A chance at redemption. A guarantee that Samuel would be safe and loved. A promise that there would be something to come back to when his debt was paid. Clara, he said hoarsely. Don't you dare say no, she interrupted, her voice fierce. Don't you dare throw away the chance to build a real life with Samuel just because you're afraid of hope. Henderson looked from Clara to Jake to the assembled townspeople, clearly calculating odds and options. His deputy had moved his hand closer to his rifle. But he was outnumbered, and they both knew it. You're asking me to show mercy to a known criminal, Henderson said finally. I'm asking you to show wisdom, Clara replied. Jake's crimes were against property, not people. He's shown genuine remorse, genuine change, and he's got a child depending on him. Surely that counts for something. Jake looked at Samuel in Clara's arms, at the woman who was willing to fight for both of them, at the community that had somehow come to accept him despite everything. The choice that had seemed impossible suddenly became clear. I'll go with you, Henderson, Jake said quietly. I'll face trial, serve whatever time the judge thinks I deserve. But Samuel stays here with Clara where he belongs. Henderson studied Jake's face for a long moment. Just like that? You're giving up? I ain't giving up, Jake replied. I'm fighting for what matters most. And what matters most is Samuel having a good life, even if I can't be part of it right away. Samuel chose that moment to reach toward Jake, making the happy babbling sounds that always made Jake's heart swell with pride and love. Jake moved closer, taking the baby's small hand in his own, memorizing the feel of those tiny fingers. You be good for Miss Clara, Jake whispered to Samuel. And remember that your papa loves you more than anything in this world. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady when she spoke. He'll remember, and he'll be here waiting when you come home. The word home hit Jake like a revelation. Somehow, without his realizing it, this place had become home. These people had become family. And Samuel had become the center of everything that mattered. It was worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, worth coming back to. Jake looked at Henderson, at the man who had pursued him for so long. I'm ready to go. Henderson nodded slowly. All right, Dunlap. But any trouble, any attempt to run, and the deal's off. The baby goes to territorial custody, and you face the full weight of the law. Won't be any trouble, Jake said. He turned to Clara, wanting to say so much that the words tangled in his throat. Take care of him. Always, Clara promised. And Jake, come back to us. Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He kissed Samuel's forehead, breathing in the sweet scent of his son's hair one last time, then stepped outside into the cold morning air. The townspeople parted to let him pass, and several of them called out words of encouragement, promises to look after Samuel, assurances that they'd be waiting for his return. As Henderson secured Jake's hands behind his back, Jake took one last look at the cabin where he'd learned to be a father, at the community that had accepted him, at Clara holding Samuel in the doorway. The baby was watching him with those serious dark eyes, and Jake tried to memorize that precious face. I'll be back, son, Jake called out. Count on it. Then Henderson was leading him toward the horses, toward whatever justice awaited him, toward a future that suddenly seemed possible instead of hopeless. Behind him, Jake could hear Clara singing softly to Samuel, the same lullaby she'd taught Jake weeks ago. The sound followed him as they rode away, a promise and a prayer wrapped in melody. For the first time in his adult life, Jake Dunlap was riding toward his future instead of away from his past. 22 months later, Jake Dunlap walked out of the territorial prison into the pale light of an early spring morning, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and a letter from Clara that had arrived the week before. The letter, creased from countless readings, contained news that had sustained him through the darkest days of his sentence. Samuel was walking now, could say Papa, and Clara and a dozen other words, and according to Clara's careful script, asked about his daddy every single day. Judge Whitman had been as fair as Clara had promised, taking into account Jake's voluntary surrender, his care of Samuel, and the testimony from the people of Millbrook, who'd traveled to the territorial capital to speak on his behalf. 2 years for restitution and rehabilitation, the judge had decreed, noting that Jake Dunlap the outlaw seemed to have already begun transforming into Jake Dunlap, the father and community member. The sentence had felt both impossibly long and surprisingly merciful. Now, standing in the bright morning air with $26 in prison wages and a heart full of hope and terror, Jake began the 3-day journey back to Millbrook, back to Samuel, back to Clara, back to the life he'd barely dared to believe would still be waiting for him. The first day of travel passed in a blur of nervous energy and desperate hope. Jake found himself cataloging every change he noticed in the landscape, every sign that time had passed while he'd been locked away. Would Samuel remember him? Would the boy still reach for him with that complete trust? Or would 2 years have turned Jake into a stranger? Clara's letters had been regular and detailed, filled with stories of Samuel's development and assurances that she spoke of Jake daily. But Jake knew that letters couldn't bridge the gulf that time and separation had created. By the second day, Jake's nervousness had given way to a deeper anxiety. What if he'd changed too much during his time in prison? What if the man who returned to Millbrook wasn't the same man who'd left? Prison had a way of hardening men, of stripping away the softer emotions that made family life possible. Jake had fought against that hardening every day, had clung to his memories of Samuel and Clara like lifelines. But he couldn't be certain he'd emerged unchanged. The third day dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crisp air that promised spring was still weeks away. Jake pushed his borrowed horse harder than he should have, driven by an urgency that had been building since the moment he'd walked out of his cell. He needed to see Samuel, needed to hold his son, needed to reassure himself that the love he'd carried through 2 years of confinement was still real and still returned. Millbrook appeared on the horizon just as the sun was beginning to set, its familiar buildings painted gold in the dying light. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as he rode down the main street, noting the small changes that marked the passage of time. Murphy's store had a fresh coat of paint. The church had a new bell tower. There were faces he didn't recognize, and he wondered if anyone would remember the outlaw who'd left with Marshal Henderson on that cold morning so long ago. Clara's boarding house looked exactly as he remembered it, down to the green shutters and the flower boxes that were just beginning to show the first hints of spring growth. Jake tied his horse to the familiar post and stood for a moment, gathering his courage. Through the lighted windows, he could see figures moving about their evening routines, and somewhere in that warm, welcoming space was a son. Before he could knock, the door opened, and Clara stood there as if she'd been watching for him. She looked older, more mature, but her gray eyes were exactly as Jake remembered them. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and Jake felt the weight of 2 years and all the words they'd never been able to say. "Jake," Clara said softly, and her voice was exactly the same, warm and steady and home. "Clara, is he?" "He's here," Clara said, stepping back to let him enter. "He's been waiting for you." Jake followed her into the familiar parlor, his eyes searching for Samuel. He found him sitting on the floor near the fireplace, playing with wooden blocks that Jake didn't recognize. The child had grown tremendously, had lost the baby roundness that Jake remembered. But there was no mistaking those serious dark eyes or the way his hair curled at the back of his neck. Samuel looked up at the sound of footsteps, and Jake watched as the boy's face went through a series of expressions: curiosity, uncertainty, and then something that might have been recognition. Samuel struggled to his feet, steadying himself against a chair, and took a tentative step toward Jake. "Pup," Samuel said, and the word hit Jake like a physical blow. Jake dropped to his knees, not trusting his legs to hold him, and opened his arms. Samuel walked toward him with the careful concentration of a child still mastering the skill, and when he reached Jake, he placed his small hands on Jake's face with the same gesture Jake remembered from infancy. Papa, Samuel said again, more certainly this time. And Jake gathered his son into his arms and held him like he never intended to let go. Samuel felt different in Jake's arms. Heavier, stronger, more solidly himself. But the essential Samuel-ness was unchanged. He still smelled like soap and milk and something indefinably sweet. Still made small, contented sounds when he was happy. Still seemed to study Jake's face with that unnerving intensity. "I missed you, son," Jake whispered against Samuel's hair. "Missed you every single day." Samuel pulled back to look at Jake's face again, his small hands patting Jake's cheeks as if to reassure himself that his father was real. "Papa home," he said solemnly. And Jake felt tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in prison finally spill over. "Yes, son, Papa's home." Clara had withdrawn to give them privacy, but Jake could see her in the kitchen doorway, tears streaming down her own face. When Samuel was finally content to play quietly in Jake's lap, Clara approached and settled into the chair across from him. "He never forgot you," she said softly. "Every night, he'd point to your picture and say Papa. Every morning, he'd ask if today was the day you were coming home." Jake looked down at Samuel, who was babbling happily while showing Jake each of his toys. The child seemed completely at ease, as if Jake's absence had been a minor interruption rather than a fundamental disruption of his world. "You did this," Jake said to Clara. "You kept me alive for him." "You stayed alive for yourself," Clara replied. "I just made sure Samuel knew his father was a good man who'd made mistakes, not a bad man who'd abandoned him." They talked long into the evening, Clara filling Jake in on the countless small details of Samuel's development that her letters couldn't capture. His first steps, his favorite foods, the words he'd learned, and the games he enjoyed. Samuel had been healthy and happy, surrounded by the entire community's attention and affection. But he'd never stopped looking for his father. "Mrs. Henderson knitted him a sweater for his birthday," Clara said, watching Samuel play with his blocks. "Murphy carved those animals he's so fond of. Tom McCready taught him to whistle, though he's not very good at it yet. He's been loved, Jake, by everyone." Jake felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the overwhelming gratitude for the kindness these people had shown his son. Samuel had been cared for not just by Clara, but by the entire community, raised by a village that had claimed him as their own. "And you?" Jake asked quietly. "How have you been?" Clara was silent for a moment, her hands folded in her lap. "Lonely," she said finally. "Worried, but hopeful. I knew you'd come back." "How could you be so sure?" "Because you're his father," Clara said simply, "and because you promised." Samuel had grown drowsy in Jake's lap, his play becoming less focused as exhaustion overtook him. Clara showed Jake how the evening routine had evolved, the bath, the story, the lullaby that Jake remembered teaching her so long ago. Samuel went to sleep easily in Jake's arms, as if no time had passed at all, and Jake sat beside the small bed Clara had set up in her own room, watching his son sleep and marveling at the miracle of being home. Later, when Samuel was settled for the night, Jake and Clara sat in her kitchen over coffee, the comfortable silence of people who had waited long for this moment. Jake found himself studying Clara's face, noting the small changes that time had wrought, the way her hair caught the lamplight, the quiet strength that radiated from her even in rest. "I don't know how to thank you," Jake said finally. "You don't need to thank me," Clara replied. "Samuel gave my life purpose when I needed it most. Caring for him wasn't a burden, Jake. It was a gift. Still, what you did, taking him in, keeping him safe, I can never repay that." Clara looked at him steadily. "I don't want repayment. I want—" She paused, seeming to gather her courage. "I want to know what happens now, where you and Samuel will go, what kind of life you're planning to build." The question Jake had been avoiding, the future he'd been afraid to plan. "I've been thinking about that for 2 years," he said slowly, "and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. This is home. Millbrook, this house, if you'll have us." Clara's breath caught. "Jake, I know I don't have much to offer," Jake continued. "No money, no property, nothing, but a willingness to work hard and be the kind of man Samuel can be proud of. But I love you, Clara. Been loving you since that first day you helped me with Samuel, and 2 years in prison didn't change that. If anything, it made it stronger." Clara reached across the table and took his hands in hers. "I've been waiting for you to come home," she said quietly. "Both of you. Samuel needs his father, and I need both of you. This house has been too quiet, too empty, even with Samuel filling it with laughter. Jake felt something settle in his chest, a peace he'd never known before. Are you saying yes? I'm saying yes to everything, Clara replied. Yes to you staying. Yes to us being a family. Yes to building the life we should have started 2 years ago. Jake lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. I won't disappoint you again. You never disappointed me the first time, Clara said firmly. You did what you had to do to protect Samuel, to give him a future. That's what good men do, Jake. That's what fathers do. They were married 3 weeks later in the Millbrook church, with Samuel toddling between them during the ceremony, his small hands clinging to both of them as if to keep his family together. The entire town turned out for the wedding. These people who had claimed Samuel as their own and had waited patiently for Jake's return. Murphy gave Clara away, since she had no family of her own. Tom McCready stood as Jake's best man, gruff and proud and claiming he'd never doubted Jake would make it back. Mrs. Henderson had made Samuel a small suit that he immediately tried to climb out of, and half the congregation spent the ceremony trying not to laugh at his antics. Judge Whitman himself performed the ceremony, having traveled from the territorial capital for the occasion. He spoke about second chances and redemption, about the power of love to transform lives, about the miracle of a child who had brought together not just 2 people, but an entire community. Jake Dunlap came to us as a stranger and a wanted man, the judge said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church. He leaves here today as a husband, a father, and a valued member of this community. That transformation didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen easily, but it happened because good people believed in the possibility of change, and because a child's need for love proved stronger than a man's fear of his past. Jake stood at the altar, Clara's hand in his, Samuel babbling happily in Tom McCready's arms, and felt the weight of his old life finally lift from his shoulders. He was no longer Jake Dunlap, the outlaw. He was Jake Dunlap, the husband, the father, the man who had chosen love over fear and found himself redeemed in the choosing. After the ceremony, the entire town gathered for a celebration that lasted well into the evening. There was music and dancing, food and drink, stories and laughter. Samuel was passed from lap to lap, the center of attention as always, clearly reveling in the excitement even if he didn't understand the cause. As the evening wound down and people began to drift toward their homes, Jake found himself standing in Clara's backyard, his backyard now, holding Samuel and watching the stars emerge in a clear spring sky. Clara joined them, slipping her arm around Jake's waist, and for a moment they stood in perfect contentment. What are you thinking about? Clara asked softly. Jake considered the question, looking down at Samuel, who was growing drowsy in his arms. Thinking about that morning when I found him on my doorstep, he said finally. How scared I was. How sure I was that I'd ruin his life. Never imagined it would lead to this. God works in mysterious ways, Clara said. Reckon he does. Takes an outlaw and an abandoned baby and turns them into a family. Takes a town full of strangers and makes them into people worth coming home to. Samuel made a small sound of protest at being kept awake, and Jake automatically began the gentle swaying motion that had always soothed the baby. Some things never changed, and Jake was grateful for the continuity, for the proof that the essential bond between father and son had survived separation and time. We should get him to bed, Clara said. In a minute, Jake replied. Just want to stand here a little longer, hold my family. Remember what it feels like to be home. Clara smiled and tightened her arm around him. We have all the time in the world now. Jake looked down at Samuel, who was fighting sleep with the determination of a child who didn't want to miss anything important. This little boy had saved him, had given him a reason to become better than he'd ever thought possible. Samuel would grow up knowing he was loved, knowing he belonged somewhere, knowing his father was a man who had chosen to fight for what mattered most. Thank you, Jake whispered to his son, pressing a kiss to the child's forehead. Samuel's eyes fluttered closed, and he settled completely in Jake's arms, trusting and safe and home. Jake Dunlap, former outlaw, current husband and father, stood under the vast frontier sky and felt the profound peace of a man who had found his place in the world. The baby who had been left on his doorstep had given him everything: love, family, community, redemption, and hope. In choosing to protect Samuel instead of himself, Jake had discovered that some things were indeed worth dying for. But more importantly, he had learned that some things were worth living for too. As Clara led them inside toward warmth and light and the promise of tomorrow, Jake carried his sleeping son and his grateful heart into the future they would build together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time. The outlaw was gone forever, replaced by something infinitely more valuable: a man who knew what it meant to be home.